Our next keynote will be on ethics and blockchain. We've talked quite a bit about kind of technologies and solutions and themes around traceability, efficiency, and transparency. So Sheila Warren of the World Economic Forum, she's the head of blockchain and data policy and a member of the executive committee, will be sharing a few thoughts on ethics and blockchain and the Presidio principles. Sheila, are you available?
I am. Yes, thanks, Ravi.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. I am actually going to share my screen. There we go. So I was asked to give a kind of a keynote here on ethics and blockchain. And kind of as we think about social impact, clearly we want to ensure that what we're building is robust and is grounded in an ethical framework that ensures that we are not engaging in enhanced exploitation of vulnerable populations. We are thinking about user rights. We are focusing kind of on the elements that we think make up a better society as a general matter. And I believe that blockchain is a tool that can help us move towards that better society. I think many of you probably share that same view, but how do we get there and how do we ensure that we're not making missteps along the way is something I think is really important to consider. So the forum has a body called the Global Blockchain Council, and I put here just a couple of different organizations that are members of this to give you a sense of the dramatically different points of view that were brought to bear by this council. We deliberately assembled, this was the inaugural Global Blockchain Council. It's had basically an 18-month term, and we brought together a very diverse group of perspectives on purpose. We wanted to bring together naysayers in the space, some funders, Bitcoin maxis, people that are anti-Bitcoin, the whole spectrum and gamut of participants. And we were interested to see if there would be agreement on output that could help spur the adoption of blockchain technology. Now, whether that was public permissionless or private or permissioned, or we were somewhat agnostic about that at the time, and remain so. But we wanted to ensure that see if there was something that needed to kind of come out that would help spur adoption in a responsible way and mitigate some of the risk that was either perceived or was actual in the space. And interestingly enough, at our first meeting, which was in this like basement, room with like very few windows kind of thing, what emerged was a consensus immediately, unanimous, that there was a really strong need for something like a blockchain bill of rights. And so we actually kind of tested the waters on that idea with an op-ed on CoinDesk that talked about a blockchain bill of rights. People went bananas, both pro and con, people went a little nuts. And we eventually wound up renaming the thing the Presidio principles. So what was clear was that there was room for this kind of document that was important. Now, I talk about my children a lot, as people who have watched me speak know, but I think it's particularly important when you talk about ethics, because what we're really building is for the next generation. We're really thinking about how might we do better than we've done in the past? How might we limit exploitation of data or, God forbid, of actual people themselves and their lives? And how can we ensure that what we're building really does remain true to principles of decentralization, which fundamentally are about a power shift, a shift in the power structure that underlies a lot of our existing systems. So how do we think about how we might do that and ensure that what we're building is not kind of blockchain washing, as we say, pretending to take advantage of some of the benefits blockchain can offer, but really at the end of the day, just rebuilding a highly centralized infrastructure on top of something that might, the tentacle of it might touch onto a blockchain, and then we kind of want to lay claim to the fact that we're kind of taking account of all of the myriad opportunities available using the technology. The hearts, by the way, are the result of marital compromise. I think it's important to point that out. We have very different views on imagery around our children. So there are 3 of them. They're adorable. I think you can get a sense of that even with the giant hearts on top of their faces. And this kind of work, this aspect of my work, I really am thinking constantly about children and next generations when we think about what we need to be doing here. Okay, so what do the principles demonstrate? I'm going to walk through this relatively quickly. We really grounded on 4 different major areas, 2 of which you see here: the notion that accessibility was important, and the notion that, oops, my apologies, the notion that, I'm just going to try to get this thing out of the way, that agency and interoperability were also important. Now, I don't think any of that is going to be particularly surprising to those who are following in the space, the things that are kind of considered critically important. Transparency and accessibility, also very, very important as well. So how do we define these things? This is where we had a lot of debate. What does it mean to be transparent? And we kind of subtexted this by saying it really is right to information about the system, as I say here. So what is it that you need to understand? And we're talking here, the U is not some highly sophisticated cryptographer who can get into the code base and really understand the details. We're not talking about that person. We're saying at a more general level, what should a user have access to information about? And really what we thought was important was to think about basic things, forms, expectations, rights and obligations, but to some extent having an ability to understand, or at least at a high level grok, what the power structure really is underlying the system. So how is it operated? Can I see the source code if I have access to make that, parsable or relatable to myself? And what are the rights and obligations of participants in that system? Like, how does that work? Now, not everyone will understand this, but we thought it was important that this kind of opportunity be made available to those that could actually have the ability to understand that or have access to those who could. On the agency interoperability front, we shifted a bit into thinking about the right to own and manage your data. Now, this is something I think that is important all over the world. It's a critical role I think blockchain is going to start playing more and more. It's the self-sovereign entity kind of conversation comes into place here. But what is it that really needs to be here when it comes to an application sitting on top of blockchain? I should note, by the way, the principles are not intended in any way to apply to protocol. They're all about applications built on top of a blockchain protocol layer, right? So that is a critical distinction. So initially, when we kind of released our op-ed about the Bill of Rights, everyone went nuts and thought we were going to kind of get into like no distribution and all this kind of stuff. And we're like, no. We're assuming all of that is its own layer, it has its own governance, it has its own consensus mechanisms, etc. We're talking about applications that are built on top of Ethereum or on top of whatever baseline protocol, and how can you ensure that you're remaining true to that protocol and not just kind of again like Ethereum washing something, right, as an example. Okay, so here we had a couple of concepts that I think are important. This idea about management of consent, what should happen with your keys and things like this. Now, what's interesting here, and I should note, not every single principle can be activated for every single protocol. Clearly, certain kinds of things don't make sense if you're in a permission system versus a permissionless system. So the idea here is not that you are, when you sign on to the principles, you're not saying every single principle here I'm adhering to strictly and you come audit me, no problem. What you're saying is the direction of the principles is important to us. And we've encouraged people, and the Ethereum Foundation did this, to issue guidance documents that really say, if you're building in this protocol, here are the things, here are the principles, 1, 7, 5, whatever, that we think are most critical, most important to protection of user rights, and really ought to be something that's almost codified in your governance mechanism or otherwise. And here are the ones that maybe are of, either they don't apply, or they're of lesser importance, or they're not practical yet, but there's a plan to kind of get us this kind of thing. So they are meant to be aspirational as opposed to strictly constructed. Okay. So then, if I could, here we go. So the other two broad areas that we came up with were privacy, security, and accountability and governance. Now, again, I don't think any of this is like earth-shattering. It's the framing, I think, and the codification of this, I think that was really groundbreaking to the community. So privacy, security is the right to data protection. Okay, so what does that mean? It's really kind of understanding what you're able to do your own risk assessment. How risky is this in terms of disclosure? How risky is it in terms of security? Are there things being stored in a mutable manner on a blockchain that are data elements that I don't really want stored in that manner, right? Maybe I need to have an ability to understand what it is I'm actually putting out there and where it's going to be visible, essentially, right? And then also just kind of ensure that there is some accountability mechanism built into place to ensure that things are operating as they say they are. That can be done through a variety of mechanisms. And then, of course, the accountability and governance, just understand where there is a failure of compliance or where you might have recourse if there are things that are problematic. Now, again, some of these things are more applicable to some kinds of protocol than others. And certainly, we've had interesting discussions all on the drafting process and the review cycles about what would happen here. I should note that for a while, these were actually on GitHub. We had some pull requests that kind of provided us a lot of different insight and input there. We ran them through our geographic communities. We ran them through all kinds of different places just to kind of make sure that we were getting a full rounding of the perspective of different participants in the ecosystem. Okay. So how can you, they're very intended to be action oriented. We have done, I'll be honest with you, we've done very, very little socializing of these. We release them. I give talks like this one occasionally here and there, but it's really been through word of mouth that we've had signatories. And what we have is we have, social media, we have all this different kind of a toolkit on how you can sign the thing. It's very easy to get in there. There's an organizational signature page. You can see it's publicly visible, and there's an individual signatory page. You can kind of see as a person. We encourage organizations that sign on to send this around to their dev community, to everyone really within their organization, to say, we are making individual commitments that every single day we are thinking about, are we considering, these principles and what we're building and how we're kind of moving forward in the ecosystem with our builds. So we've had over, even despite the sort of, we've been kind of quiet in the release of it. We've had over 100 organizations already adopt the principles, and here are some of the names of some of the ones. Some of these groups were part of the drafting and review process, others were not. Very pleased to announce that BSIC, this coalition, has signed on to the principles as well. We were very pleased to see that and grateful for that. And you can see it reflects a variety of different perspectives from the community in terms of what should be done and what should be held, the standards should be held to going forward. And here are just some comments that people have said about these, that they are how they can help benchmark and how they can help internal companies kind of get a steer on how they should be thinking about development. We've had companies come to us and say they're using this in sprint cycles or kind of doing like a sprint check against the principles. We've had governments come in and say that their procurement processes are kind of asking people that are taking bid to basically check in with the principles and see if they can comply with them and what that one might look like. We've had funders come in and tell us that when it comes to kind of like VC, you can see that they kind of want to ensure that the build is in compliance with these principles. We've had a variety of different ways that different actors are implementing the principles and providing guidance around how to engage with them. Here's our QRR. You can certainly sign on to them individually or collectively, although as noted, the coalition's already signed on. And we always encourage people to share back with us. What are you doing with them? How are they in operation? We're considering doing a bigger, like another kind of a launch round or action round now that we have some of these major players signed on to kind of get a little more circulation, particularly globally. We're very interested in these expanding globally. We've had signatories from I think every continent at this point, well, not Antarctica, but every of the 6 continents, we have signatories from every continent. And again, this is without very much marketing of the thing, if you will, which I think demonstrates how critical this is seen to the ecosystem and how important people are considering these kinds of questions. So with that, I will stop my share and turn to questions, if there are any.
Great, thank you, Sheila. Does anyone have any questions or observations?
Kind of looking in the chat just to see.
Well, I just wanted to say that we're really excited to have signed on to the principles and want to make sure that our members have access to this toolkit and sort of framework to think about, when they're creating solutions, to be, mindful and considerate about all these important topics and embed that in the technology.
And we're so grateful, Vanessa. Really appreciate it.
I think there's a question. Sorry, Ravi.
Sheila, I wasn't sure if you were, I don't know if you were on earlier, but we had some interesting conversations about digital rights as human rights, and also some thoughts on kind of legal frameworks and government regulations. How do you see these principles intersecting with efforts being made by different governments or different other regulatory bodies?
It's a great question. And we tried very hard to not just mirror, GDPR or something like that. The first draft, that's funnily enough, we were kind of like, oh, we kind of wrote GDPR again. We're like, oh, that's not gonna work. So to throw that out and kind of go back to the drawing board. We deliberately tried to strike a neutral pose in terms of regulation, in part because I think it's impossible to future-proof something like this against regulation. So the principles are really much more foundational and fundamental, and they're really focused on build. So they really are focused more on what people are building in this space, and how they're hooking into, how these applications can actually leverage the benefits of a blockchain while still remaining cognizant of user rights. So I think that's the frame. It's not a regulatory frame. They're not meant to be a proxy for regulatory compliance at all. But I think when you read them in detail, you'll see that we are there is a future proofing about regulation that we know is coming down the pipe. You know, we don't address certain things like digital assets specifically. It's not that kind of document. It's really not a regulatory document, but certainly we had to take into consideration things like GDPR, the CCPA, other kinds of data protection regulations, but also some of the digital asset regulation that was coming that we were expecting to see, and that some of which has come and some of which is not, and ensure that we actually weren't going to be butting up, you know, against that or in contradiction to any of that. And I think that we did a very good job, at least thus far. Nothing that's come out has been even in the ballpark of contradictory with the principles here.
That's wonderful. So I think we're going to look forward to seeing how that evolves and then being a part of that journey at this point.